let's get started. Thanks for coming to the March SGF AWS meeting. We're going to talk about using the AWS Simple Storage Services, or more frequently known as S3. I'm going to talk about these basic concepts. Today we're going to cover how the service is priced, the type of metrics you can tap into, some of the basic terminology, and then we're going to go on into specifics related to the different service levels or service types that they offer, and when you might use one over another, some of the storage options that you'll see on a per bucket or a per object basis. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of extra detail on events or triggers that can happen when objects are written to your S3 buckets, because that's a magical thing that a lot of people don't take enough advantage of, in my opinion. And then just some other tips and tricks we've learned along the way as we've used S3 to store our millions and millions and millions of objects that we literally have out there. I mean, we love S3. So with that, let's talk about S3 pricing. I'm going to focus on standard storage pricing, because I'd say that most people are going to start with that, and so that's going to be what you're going to see on your monthly bill at first. There are opportunities to get lower pricing or decreased pricing, and we'll talk more about that as well. But to start off, standard storage, you're basically looking at 0.023 dollars per gigabyte, or 2.3 cents per gigabyte. And that, when you're working with a lot of data, that works out to $23 a terabyte. A lot of people find it handy to see that comparison because they don't show that. They bill you in gigabyte increments, but it's a little bit clumsy to think of it in cents. They also charge you, so they charge for the amount of storage you're using. They also charge for the number of requests that you're making to the bucket or from the service. This service is designed to be a write once and read many. Now, the technology that backs it isn't like a worm drive or anything. It's, but the idea is that they want to use this for data distribution. That's how it's designed. That's how it's architected, and so you're going to pay a premium to write to the service compared to what you pay for reads from the service or downloads and distributions from the service. And to give you an idea, their website, and I'll hop over to the site in a second to show you this pricing. They price these requests by the 1,000. We look at them by the million, but I wanted you to know you're not going to see a minimum $5 charge. It's like a half of a cent or something. They charge $5 per million request for put, copy, post, and even list request, which is showing a list of the objects that match a certain prefix or the objects that are in a store. They charge less than 10% of that fee for GET requests. So you can sort of see how they offer a discount for the GET request. They also charge for transfer or bandwidth type fees, and those fees can range from free all the way up to, at the highest point, 9 cents per gigabyte or $90 a terabyte, which if you price that compared to other hosting providers, that's usually pretty competitive for what you're getting. On the free side, when you transfer anything into the service, they waive fees. You almost never see fees related to data moving into Amazon. There are a few different reasons for that. Obviously, from a marketing or market perspective, that's sort of genius, because they want your data. I mean, they want you to be hosting there, so they're not going to penalize you for that. But there are other reasons for that as well. And then those transfer fees increase depending on exactly where that data is going. If you're sending the data to CloudFront, which is their CDN service, they do not charge for the data transfer from S3 to CloudFront, because they do charge from CloudFront out to the internet. So they're not going to double charge you. from our experience, all of their billing has been very fair, but it can be confusing. So this is a very simple summary of the overall billing, but when you're transferring within a region, the fees are a fraction of that 9 cents per gigabyte. When you're transferring inter-region, they're a little bit more. That 9 cents per gigabyte is transferring out from S3 to the general internet. Let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at what that pricing page looks like. So I'm just Googling for S3 pricing. And going to their /S3/pricing page. And you can see where I'm pulling these numbers. The numbers vary by region. This page is defaulting to US East Ohio because that's the region closest to us. Most of the US regions are pretty similar. And these are the prices we were just talking about. The first 50 gigabyte, I can zoom in on this to make it a little bit easier to read for you guys. The first 50 gigabyte per month are priced at the 2.3 cents per gigabyte. Beyond that, you start to see discounts, but most of us aren't going to benefit from that. We're going to cover these other storage types a little bit later, but you'll notice that if you bump from standard storage to infrequent access storage, your price decreases from 2.3 cents per gigabyte to half of that. And then if you bump down to Glacier storage, which is meant to be a long-term archival storage, it drops another 66% from IA. Yeah, the request pricing I talked about is listed here. They talk about the different types of requests and the price for those. That is not tiered. That's a flat rate regardless of the number of requests for standard storage. But you'll notice that infrequent access has different rates. Infrequent access is just that, designed to be accessed infrequently, and because of the way they store it, they charge you more for put requests and get requests and things like that. And so if you start to use that, you need to be sure you run the numbers in the cost calculator and figure out if you're going to benefit from that. And then Glacier requests get a little bit more complicated. We're not going to talk about that pricing a whole lot today, but I do want to mention that you want to watch out if you use Glacier. You want to make sure that you aren't moving things back out of Glacier right away. I mean, obviously, if you're in a DR situation and you have a disaster and you need the data, you need the data. But if you have things in Glacier and you can slowly pull them out instead of pulling everything out at once, because of the way their numbers work out, it's almost like a 90% billing situation. That's probably the easiest thing I could compare it to. If you trickle the data out instead of pulling it all out at once, you're not going to have a heart attack when you see your bill. The other piece with that is if you're putting it in Glacier, plan to have it there for a while because they do penalize you if you put it in Glacier and delete it right away. So it really is meant to be a long-term archival, and as long as you're planning on that and it's not going to be accessed much, it's a great option. Like I said, we'll talk about it a little bit more. And then they have some other pricing for advanced metrics. The data transfers are covered here. All data transfer in is free. Data transfer out is tiered to the internet, so the more data you transfer, the less it costs. The first gig is free though, so if you're just experimenting with it, you won't see a fee on your bill if you're transferring a few hundred meg. And then they talk about data transfer out from S3 to all of their various services and what those prices look like. They also have a transfer acceleration service. We're not going to talk a whole lot about that today. Its pricing is listed here. They also offer the ability to replicate their information between buckets in different regions. And if people are interested in that, I can answer questions about that afterwards, but that's a little bit more of an advanced topic. And then they get into the Gov Cloud pricing. So, back. Oops. What was the question? Yes, CRR, cross-region replication. The idea being when you store, this goes great into well, we're not quite to terminology, but that's a great lead into the terminology. Basically, when you store your information in S3, it's written to, you tell them, I want to write this to this region, maybe US East 1, US East 2, US 1, West 1, West 2, and they will guarantee you that that data will never leave that region. So anything that you put in Virginia will always be in Virginia, but it's not put on a single hard drive. When you write that data to that service, they write it out to at least 2 systems in one of the AZs, in one of the data centers in that region, and then it's immediately replicated to at least 2 devices in another AZ in that region. I want to say there's even more replication involved than that, but I know that they guarantee at the end of that write, you have 4 copies of your data, which is how they're able to achieve the 11.9 availability in terms of 99 point however many 9% guarantee that you won't lose your data and that you'll be able to reach it. But for some people, that's not enough, and it's not because they're afraid that all 4 of those copies are going to go stale at the same time, but you could have a natural disaster in a region where the region is completely taken offline, and that may affect all 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 data centers depending on the region. You may have some sort of administrative error that causes something in a region to be deleted or wiped out. And so cross-region replication that you mentioned, since I'm not talking about it later, I'm covering it now because that's a great question. That allows you to say, I want this bucket in this region to be replicated over to this other region, and you can specify the 2 regions. And some people will do that for DR sake. Other people will do that for performance sake. I mean, if you're operating a national or a global brand, you're going to want your data to be close to your customers. And so there are a few different reasons for that, but they cover the pricing there. All right, back on track. S3 metrics. We talked, I'm leading with this just because we talked about this last month in our monitoring AWS resources. So I'm not going to cover it very heavily, but I want to emphasize when you set up the S3 service, they include the ability to see how many objects are in your bucket. They include the ability to see how much build usage you have, and I'll show you what that looks like real quick. Let's see which account I'm in here. If I go into S3, yeah, we're in the account with data, so this will be helpful to show you this. I can go to a bucket. I'm going to click on the bucket, and then I'm going to go to management, and I'm going to go to metrics. And then they have this page where you can see the status of that particular bucket. And in this particular bucket's case, I'm able to see the last week, and because the bucket isn't growing a whole lot, it looks like it's a pretty steep curve, but realistically, a week ago this bucket was at 22 gigabytes, and now it's at 22.4 gigabyte. So you can see that bucket is growing. You can also see the number of objects in the bucket. We don't keep as close of an eye on this, but spikes can indicate some sort of problem if tons of objects are suddenly ending up in the bucket, especially if a bucket is versioned, because that means that every time you write to the bucket, it saves a new version, whether the data is different or not. So something to be aware of. Those are built in. You have the ability to add other types of metrics, like metrics about your request, metrics about your data transfers. We haven't been using those. Jason, can you say anything about that? Or are those things that you would recommend people look at, or when would those be valuable to users?
With the data transfer metrics,
Mm-hmm.
on those can drive your bill.
And see our bill, the S3 portion of our bills, so reasonable that I haven't really stressed about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
We had a situation with requests where we had some code that
Okay, that makes sense. So Jason with IHS is saying that these can be really handy in a case where you're troubleshooting performance problems with your application or seeing or needing to manage costs if you're seeing high S3 costs. But I mostly want you to be aware that they're out there and that you don't have to pay for these object count and build usage stats, because I've had other people tell me that they assumed that you had to turn on something to see that. So S3 terminology, we're going to talk about buckets, objects, keys, regions, and then consistency. So let's go back over here to the S3 console. And I'm actually going to go over to a clean console that doesn't have a million things going on, so bear with me. All right. So when you first go into S3, you have no buckets. They have a walkthrough that shows you how to create a bucket and upload data. Let's go ahead and create our first bucket. A bucket stores objects, and it's sort of the foundation layer of S3. There's really no reason that you couldn't put all of your data in one bucket, but most people will group data by maybe who needs to access it, so that they can apply access rules to different buckets, or by maybe who needs to pay for it, because then you can easily see costs per bucket. There are other reasons that you would want separate buckets. In our case, we have different buckets for different categories of data, because some of our data needs to be kept indefinitely, and so it might have some sort of life cycle where we can apply a life cycle, and we'll talk about these rules a little bit later, but we can apply a rule to the entire bucket that says after so many days this data can go to infrequent access, meaning we don't expect to access the data often, so why don't we drop our cost by half, and then after so many months we're going to move this data to Glacier, which if you're talking about log type data that you maybe would want to keep on hand for regulatory purposes, or in our case security auditing and things, in case we ever realize something's going on and we need to go back through all of our activity. Normally, we're not going to look at data from 9 months or a year ago when it comes to some of our system access and S3 access and things like that, but having that available might be handy later, and with what they charge for Glacier, it's easy to justify keeping it around. Yes?
How often can you move your data to Glacier? Is it move always converted? Is it the access that is certain?
So that's a great question. He was asking, how often can you move data to Glacier? You can set up those rules to where they're applied on a per object basis. So if you have 1,000 objects come in every day, it would see that maybe 1,000 of those objects, or maybe even one object is now old enough that it needs to be moved to Glacier, and they don't have any sort of restriction on how many objects need to be moved to Glacier or how few objects. There is a something to be aware of, though, when it comes to what you move to Glacier. They charge a minimum per object fee. So if you have a lot of very small objects, you need to be aware of that and figure that into your cost savings, because that may offset whatever savings you would have realized by moving to Glacier. If your objects are, say, a quarter the size of that minimum, well, then all of a sudden your Glacier costs are 4 times more than you would have expected. But no, that's a great question. They don't really have any restrictions on that. When you do restore from Glacier, that's some sort of process that takes data offline and brings it back online. So you would come back to your S3 console and you would see that it had been recategorized as standard storage instead of Glacier storage, and at that point you could download it. Once it's in Glacier, though, you have to request that it be restored. You can't just go and download it at any time. So let's create our bucket. When you create a bucket, they want you to use a DNS compliant bucket name. More importantly, it has to be a globally unique name. Like, I couldn't create a bucket called test, because most likely someone else that uses Amazon has created that bucket. Yeah, and I don't have any buckets in my account, so that's something that, like I said, has to be globally unique. In our case, we use a prefix, and so that would hopefully lower our chances of conflicting with someone else. With this being the SGF AWS test account, I'll use an SGF AWS prefix. Thank you, spell check. I don't want straws. And we'll call this example bucket. We can choose where we're going to create the bucket. We'll stick with the US East. And we can copy our additional settings from another bucket. And when we go through these settings, you'll hopefully appreciate why you would want to copy them and not input them by hand every time. We can enable versioning on the bucket. We can enable logging on the bucket, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. We can enable tagging and encryption. Let me look at my slide deck. I might go ahead and cover those now while we're talking about buckets. Yeah, let's do that. When you set up a bucket, if you want an audit trail of what has been written to that bucket, and you want to see every copy of a file that has been written to that bucket, versioning is perfect for you. We can turn on versioning, and then at that point, every time we upload a file with the same name, the old version is stored. In our case, we receive daily files from point of sales. Anytime that day has changed at the restaurant, we want to know that, but more importantly, we don't want to lose the old data. We want to be able to see what changed. But 99% of the time, we only need the latest data. So versioning is great for us because we can drill down to that file, and it will show that there are multiple versions, and if they happen to mess up the data on their end, I mean, user error can happen, we're able to restore the data because we have the different versions. You can also log everything that's happening in your bucket. This is sort of a chicken and egg thing because the server access logging logs to an S3 bucket. So in this case, I would need to create a bucket. We normally log to a separate bucket so that you don't end up in sort of a circular loop. We had a logging bucket logging to itself, and I was looking through our account and trying to understand why this bucket was so busy, because that shouldn't have been used for years. Yeah, every time it would log something, it would let itself know that it had been logged. So don't do that. And so that's why I'm not going to choose this bucket as the target bucket. But in that particular case, your path to your files looks much like a file system path that you would have on a file server on your computer. And so you could say, give it a target prefix and say that I want, let's suppose I had an SGF AWS logs bucket. I would normally, I'm clicking on this just so I can see the name. I would normally send the logs to a prefix with the same name as my current bucket. Does that make sense? That way they're not all lumped together. I can tell this prefix contains the logs for this particular bucket. AWS example. And then everything below that prefix would be related to this example bucket. But like I said, I would choose a target bucket of SGF AWS logs here. So we're going to cancel that one because we don't want to log to itself. But I'm going to hop down to object level logging because this has a little bit different use case. This allows you to log your activity to CloudTrail, which is more of a log streaming service than reading individual files. And it will allow you to log every read and write of your objects. I imagine the content is the same as what you would find in your S3 logs. What kind of differences would you expect between object level logging and the server access logging, Jason? Anything in particular? I don't think so either. It's just another way to ingest your log data. So In our case, we've always chosen one or the other. We haven't found a benefit for both, but I always defer to.
For setting up a living more easily.
Maybe so. Let's see. You can also configure tags, and tags can be helpful for a number of different things. I mean, our primary use case with tags would be something like department. That's sort of a generic term for how we would use it, but you could have a department and have something like HR or accounting. I'm trying to give you something that you could apply to your own environment. But at that point, we could drill down into billing by tag. So we could see cost by department if everything had a department tag. There are other use cases for tags as well. I know that we underutilize them. So if you are aware of a great tag use case, let me know. But billing has been helpful for us. And then within the last few months, they've allowed you to configure a default for encryption. I highly recommend using their AES 256 option. With that, they generate a separate encryption key for every single object that they store, and then they manage all of those keys, and then they use sort of an account key that rotates to protect all of those keys. So they're doing the heavy lifting for you, and we haven't seen a cost or performance penalty related to that, and it allows all of your data at rest to be encrypted. If you didn't want Amazon to be able to see your data, they have other options where you could encrypt client side and upload the data to Amazon. But at least for what we're doing, we're of the opinion that Amazon can probably engineer something better than we can, and so we go with their platform. They also have the ability for you to use sort of their key management system, but as a service to where you're managing the keys. It's not to the point where it's in-house. Jason, do you guys use that at all? Or
They really encourage use of KMS for anything that might have an external request put into them.
Okay.
Say a federal agency would come and say, we want that data. Because if they're managing the keys, it's potentially possible they could access it. Otherwise, they say, we don't,
then that would have to go to the customer.
Yes.
Okay. So Jason's point with KMS versus their server-side encryption is that if there's some sort of data request that comes to Amazon, they would have to defer to their customer because KMS doesn't give them access to the keys, which I didn't realize. So I'm, like I said, going to go with the AES 256 encryption, and then when you set permissions, I wouldn't go too crazy on this page. The train of thought at AWS seems to be use IAM, the account their security policies rather than this, because this is what they started with years and years ago, and it's just not nearly as flexible. Is that your impression? Okay. You do want to make sure that you don't allow public access to the bucket unless you're trying to host a public website, in which case this would be a place to turn that on. You could grant public access to the bucket here. They warn you that you're doing that though, because most use cases are private storage. And there's actually another way to enable public read access through IAM that I think they'd recommend. And then they also have this option if you are setting up logging, like we just talked about. When you set up that logging bucket, you would want to enable this option to grant Amazon S3 log delivery write access to the bucket, because that allows them to write to your bucket. We're not going to turn that on here, but be aware of that when you do go to set up a logging bucket. And with that, they present an overview, and then you can create your bucket.
Ask a question.
Yeah, I'm going to create a logs bucket while you're asking. Go ahead.
Where you have your log files, does your log files show the user that accessed it? Is that in that information or not?
it will show the IP that accessed it, and if it runs through an IAM policy, it will also tell you which policy was used. And because of the way our policies are structured, that allows us to narrow it down to a specific server or service within our architecture. And at that point, then we can look at application logs to figure out where that request originated from on that server. So it gives you enough information that you can certainly track back and figure out where it came from. But they wouldn't know who the end user would be. But they would certainly know where the request came from, and they can show you that. No, great question. Any other questions while I'm setting this up? We don't need versioning on logs. We don't need logging on logs. We'll go ahead and turn on encryption on the logs. Then grant next. All right. So now this is what it looks like when you have multiple buckets in your account. That's really what I was going for here. If you need to edit a bucket, you click on the bucket picture. If you click on the bucket name, it goes into the bucket. But you can click on the picture of the bucket, and then it shows your properties and such over here. And you can click on them to make changes to all of these settings that we just looked at. All right. So now we have buckets. Let's go and upload something to our buckets. I'm going to talk about individual objects now, because it's helpful if you understand how these objects are stored. You'll see that they give you the ability to upload a file or to create a folder, but they don't really have folders. A lot of people just assume that this is a one-to-one relationship to a local file system. Literally, every single object that is in your bucket is in the root of the bucket. And an object may have a name that represents prefixes or folders, as they're calling it here, but just be aware that that object name is that entire path, including all of the folders ahead of it. So let's add files. Let's see what we have here. I'm going to just upload a weekly manager report. And it's asking about permissions. We're not going to worry about permissions here because they should be managed through our IAM policies. It's asking about the storage class. It defaults to standard. We're going to stick with that for now, but if you knew right off the bat that you wanted a different storage class, you could choose that here. And you have these same options when you upload through the SDK or the CLI. So when you're a developer and interfacing with S3, all of this is going to be very, very familiar. There's pretty much a one-to-one relationship with what you have in those interfaces. You can turn on encryption here. You can configure metadata per device or per object, and I'm going to cover that briefly because we've found, for example, if you interface with S3 from the PHP or JavaScript SDKs, when you request files from S3, if you upload the file as a gzip file and you download the file through the SDK, it acts like the file wasn't encrypted. There isn't not encrypted, compressed. It acts like the file wasn't compressed to begin with. So you realize that extra storage savings without having another step when you're reading the file. So to do that, you would configure content encoding. And I'm going to switch over to our bucket and just show you what that might look like. Because we do that on all of them. Let's see. So here's a file that came in. And you'll notice that all of them show .gz. And they have two pieces of metadata. In this case, we're setting the content encoding to gzip. And just like any web browser, I mean, if from Chrome to Firefox to Edge, if a web server serves up a file compressed, they're using this exact same compression. They're using gzip compression, sorry, and then they're returning a request header that says content encoding gzip, and the client decompresses it on the fly. We also set a content type on every single item. In this particular case, that's just some sort of text file that we're receiving from the vendor. So we're setting a content type of text plain. They give you something you can search through, so you could set a PDF type, or you could set other things like that, to where then if I go to download this file directly from the S3 service, either with my code, or I send a link to the end user so that they can download the file, it's just opened correctly. It's automatically decompressed, and because it's aware of the file type, it will generally preview it if you're sending a link to the end user and it's a PDF, like let's say you're storing all of your invoices in S3, it would automatically render that in the browser. So when you're setting up your metadata headers, you can do that here. You can also do that through, like I said, the CLI or the SDK. You can set up tags on a per object basis, and then you review, and then you upload. And at that point, since I have versioning turned on, I'm going to upload this exact same thing a second time just so that you can see what that looks like. And I apologize, that's just the latest thing that was downloaded, so there's not really a strategy here. But now at this point, I have two versions of my file. You'll see the file that was uploaded at 1242.01 and the file that was uploaded at 1242.18. Can you see that all right? You'll notice I uploaded the exact same file. So you have to be really careful about that if you do turn on versioning, because they don't watch out for duplicate files on your behalf. You have to manage that process on your own. So you have buckets and objects. Let's see what else we need to talk about here. I was talking about keys in terms of the path to that object. So don't show that file. It's just a pain to get back from. It's nothing terribly super secret because it's transactional data. Okay, so you can see here, that's not what I was looking for, but this, let me try to zoom into this. Okay, copy path, this is what I'm looking for. You can see this is the path to my file, and can everyone see that okay? If not, I can maybe zoom in, but that path is the object. It's not in a folder, that's just the name of the object. That is the object key. So I want to be sure that you understand that, so that when you read about S3 or implementing it, you're not trying to figure out, well, it asked for the bucket and it asked for the key, but how do I specify the folder? It's all one piece. And that's enough on that, I suppose. But that was a confusing piece even for me. And then we talked a little bit about regions already, but do be aware that when you upload something to a region, it's not going to leave the region unless you turn on the cross-region replication. And the reason that they do that is for compliance purposes. I mean, if somebody uploads something to a US region, they don't want it to end up in a EU region and have to deal with those compliance issues unless they're working in the US and the EU. And then finally, as far as terminology goes, consistency is something to be aware of. Initially, when S3 rolled out, everything was considered eventual consistency. That means you'll upload an object to a bucket, and eventually that object will be replicated to the other devices that I talked about. The multiple devices in the main data center, the multiple devices in the other data center in that same region. They now offer consistent read in US East 1 or in all regions. How, do you know offhand? They've staged that out, but we're not seeing consistent read still. So I don't know exactly. My point with this is, be aware that there is a difference, that the service was designed for eventual consistency. So if you write something to S3 and you expect to be able to immediately turn around and read the object, it's not always going to be there. At least that's our current experience. And I believe there is a way to turn that on. We didn't necessarily need it. When we ran across it and realized that was what was happening, we just lived with it. It wasn't a big deal. It was just understanding what was going on, and I want to be sure that then when you run into that and you say, well, my code uploaded it over here, and then it created a job to process the file over here, and I went and processed it so quickly that it's saying it's not there. That's probably what's happening. You might have to implement a few second delay just to give it a little bit of time, or make sure that if you're getting a file not found when you're processing something that just arrived in S3, that you have some sort of back-off mechanism where it will retry and it doesn't just die.
I assume that you can trigger some kind of a notification or a callback when consistency is completed?
I believe so, yes. In our case, it's very rare to have that happen, so we just throw back on the queue and try later. But I believe that is available.
Through SNS or something like that?
And then they have S3 storage types. Well, and back to Tom's question. Tom's question was, do they have the ability to issue callbacks so that you know when it's consistent? And I believe there is an option when you save the file, you can wait for a response that confirms it's consistent. But I don't know that for a fact. Do you guys know?
The main thing we have is when triggers happen when you put a file.
Right.
And then you go to read the file, even though the trigger says the file's there.
Right. Yeah.
It still may not be.
Well, and it hasn't been for us. We'll talk about that here in a second. So now we're going to go in a little bit faster mode because we've already talked on a lot of this, but standard versus infrequent access versus Glacier. Like I said, most of the time you're going to be using standard access, but it is more expensive than the others. So if you do have information that you're storing long term, do look at the infrequent access or even Glacier options. They're right in a lot of cases, but not all. So don't just assume my data is going to sit here forever. I need to put it out there in Glacier. That's not always the right approach. But reach out to me through Slack if you have specific use cases and you'd like some feedback or opinions on what you're doing. I'd be glad to help out when you're evaluating those type of things, because we've looked at all three pretty closely. We've talked about the different storage options when we were walking through creating buckets and uploading objects. So I'm not going to touch on these a whole lot other than we're going to talk a little bit about static hosting. Now you can host entire websites on S3, or you could just host your static assets on S3. We're hosting images and CSS and JavaScript and things like that out in S3. And we actually had a conversation in the Slack channel about 6 weeks ago about this. So I posted a brief how-to on hosting static items in S3 and then using CloudFront to distribute those items. I'm not going to go through the entire process, but I'm going to at least show you those few pieces so that you know what to look for here. And then if that's something you're interested in doing, pull up that step-by-step guide in the Slack channel or reach out to me. My cards are on the back table, and I'll send you that information. But the gist of it is you would create a bucket in S3, which we've already done, and then you would go to CloudFront, and in our particular case, we host our domain names with Amazon, so we use their Route 53 DNS service. But when I create a CloudFront distribution, it's going to give me the option to create an SSL certificate. It's not clear to me if you'll have that option if you're not already using their DNS services, but they make it a single click process, and it talks about that in the step-by-step guide where you can say, I want to SSL protect this, and let's zoom in a little bit, and you would create a web distribution, you would give it an origin name, and let's see, you would choose where the files are coming from, whether or not you want to restrict access, whether or not people can use HTTPS, whether they can only use HTTPS, and what to do about the HTTP requests. In our case, we generally redirect HTTP to HTTPS. We want to serve everything over SSL, but we don't necessarily care if a request comes in over HTTP. I mean, they're not. We're not talking about secret information. We're just trying to abide by best practices here. And then they have a lot of other overwhelming options here that I'm not going to get into. Literally, the step-by-step guide talks about how to do this. But a key piece, you can enter an alternate domain name. So you could enter cdn.mydomain.com, and then you could issue an SSL certificate for that domain name. And at this point, you would follow through with the certificate manager, and you would request that cert, and you would tell it, I need a cert for this domain name, or these domain names. I believe that's a comma-separated list. But if you go to our website, you can see this in action, logicforte.com, and then behind the scenes, open image, a new tab. This image, I'm lying, that particular image is not. I don't know who made this website. No, I'm kidding. They're in this room. So here we go. So you'll see in this particular case, this is being sent from cdn.logicforte.com, which literally this file is in an S3 bucket, and then we're using CloudFront with the SSL turned on to distribute those files. And then our CMS, when we upload new images to the CMS, it puts them in S3. So that's a pretty simplistic example, but it seems like a practical one that most people could use here.
You don't have to have domains managed by Route 53 in order to do SSL certificates. It does domain verification.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, they make it super easy. The comment was you do not have to have your domain name with registered with Route 53 to use the certificates. You just have an extra step. But they make it super simple where literally you go through a couple motions and then they immediately verify it because they know that you manage the domain. So it's just really easy, but I'm glad to hear that. I'm not going to go through the entire process here, but I showed you the end result there, and that was the important piece. Like I said, if you want to see that step-by-step guide, I've already put it together and shared it with Slack. Other storage options, we've talked about encryption tags, and we didn't talk about events a whole lot. Jason and I were chatting about that when we talked about eventual consistency, but if you need to know every time a new event appears or a new object appears in S3, you have a few different ways that you can receive notifications of those events. You can subscribe to them through what Tom suggested, the SNS, the Simple Notification Service, or in our case, every time an object arrives, because our architecture is very queue-based very queue-based, we have something go to SQS, the Simple Queuing Service, and S3 will generate a queue object, and then we just watch for new items in the queue, and sometimes we'll get hundreds or thousands of items all at once, and we'll just work through them as we have time, because with what we're doing, the batch processing at night, that doesn't have to be done immediately, but we want it done in 5 or 10 minutes. And so we get those notifications and can immediately start working on processing those files that have arrived. But if you do get into that, you have a lot of different options nowadays, because you can even send notifications to Lambda, I believe. I don't know if that's driven through SNS or how they get the notifications there, but when you set that up, you'll see those type of options, the serverless architecture, and we'll cover more of that later in the year. With events, yeah, that's an old slide. So, questions? We've got 5 minutes. I'll talk a little bit more about events if you don't, But anybody? Anything that I missed that was promised? Since we do have a little bit of time.
There was I went down the CloudFront rabbit hole a few
Yes.
weeks ago.
Okay.
And I was trying to do some calculations in the price estimator.
Okay.
To see what it might cost.
Yes.
And I thought I saw something about how if there was custom SSL involved, it would cost like.
That's a great
ton more
question. A
money.
gajillion dollars or $0. Those are the two options, and I can explain that. So what Miranda's asking.
I didn't do it, but.
No, yeah, and you wouldn't need to. What Miranda's referring to is this option right here. I know exactly what you're referring to because other people have asked me about it. There is an option, and I might not be able to show you the option until we choose an SSL certificate, but Amazon allows you to request your own IP address for your CloudFront distribution so that you can serve out HTTPS to any client that doesn't support SNI. For those who aren't familiar with the way SSL works in HTTP land, I'll give you the couple minute progression of how HTTP has come about. Long time ago, when you hosted websites, every single website had to be on a different IP address. That's just how it was. And then they came up with name-based hosting, but that only worked for HTTP. At that point, you could put a ton of websites on the same IP address, and you would send your request along with the host name that you wanted to see, and then they would return that website, even if there were 100 or 1,000 websites on the same IP. But when SSL came about, the SSL request is encrypted. The server doesn't have a way to see what you're requesting. They can't read that header until they decrypt it, and they can't go through that process until they reply with, like, this is the site that I'm about to show you, and that caused some complications early on. So for a long time, even though they had name-based hosting for insecure websites, you had to have a separate IP for every single SSL website. We're well beyond those days. Unless you're dealing with some sort of older hardware or older software that has very specific requirements, most everyone is going to be able to use the free service that puts all multiple SSL websites on the same IP address. Before we focused on the restaurants, we did hosting, and we still have some hosting business, and we migrated tons of websites over to Let's Encrypt, a free SSL product, and even though they were all on shared IP addresses, we had absolutely no problems, no customer complaints. I mean, every modern browser is able to handle that just fine. So Amazon gives you the option to set up CloudFront so that your website or your distribution is on its own IP address in case you're having to deal with some sort of legacy hardware or software, but most people wouldn't need that. And we are using the free option, or the not $100 or $1,000 a month option, or whatever the cost is. And
It's obvious when you're going through that how to do the not.
they make it obvious. Yeah, they warn you if you choose it. It's fine.
You do add. Are you saying you? Yeah. What happens that you do choose the custom SSL certificate?
Sure.
option?
Let me
Is that what you-
hop over to our account and see if I can pull that up and show you what that looks like. Just because I want to assure you that it is reasonably transparent. This account probably only has those CDNs, but at least that'll show you what you're wanting to see. So I'm going into the AWS console. I'm going to CloudFront. And yeah, I only have those CDNs here, but that's fine. In this case, that'll tell us what we need to know. When I'm editing options, custom SSL client support, by default it chooses SNI, server name notification, which they've come up with a way where when the browser sends a request, the request includes the host name in the clear. So even before the key negotiation happens, the server knows who you want to see. And then they have this all clients, 600 a month, prorated charge applies. That would be your legacy clients. That would be your people on Windows XP, maybe. No, even the latest. It'd be pretty old stuff.
98 probably.
What's that?
Windows 98 probably.
Yes, there you go. He's right. I mean, you're talking pretty old stuff. Even at XPSP3, I think that browser supports SNI, though nobody would want to use that browser. They'd normally install Chrome or Firefox because that's IE6 land. But yeah, we're talking pretty old stuff. At this point, I would be shocked if you had anybody affected by that option. Any other questions?
I want to make a comment on that one, why you would need a static IP. We run into it a lot of times where people are wanting to whitelist this specific source of information.
That's a good point.
They trust you and your one website. They don't always do it by website name to the web proxy. Sometimes they'll do it off of the network.
Really?
And so they lock it down to that.
That's a good comment. So the suggestion was some end users will filter by IP instead of by host name, and if you are sharing an IP, that could become a problem. We haven't run into that. Fortunately, we deal with customers who are filtered, and everyone's been able to allow our service by name. But I could see where that could be a problem. That's a great point. Anything else?
You mentioned your CMS system. So how easy is to integrate the CMS system with speed?
Most CMS seem to have support for object store, whether that be Amazon or Microsoft or Google nowadays. I mean, in this particular case, we're using Wagtail CMS, and it was an add-on module, but everything was open source. But even WordPress has built-in support for that, and I would imagine a lot of commercial CMS would have support, but I don't know what the landscape looks like. I know that it's becoming more and more popular because it allows you to publish your website and have all of your code on sort of a scaling platform and have all of your static objects in more of a CDN. And so architecture-wise, it's becoming pretty popular. Any other questions? If not, that is all I have. So make sure you settle up and with